In this presentation, we will take a look at the concept of forms within QuickBooks Pro 2019. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are on the home page. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the View tab and selecting the Open Windows list. We're going to be discussing forms here. If you'd like to jump straight to the data input, you can do so starting with section 6. That's when we start a new company file. We're working on navigating through the file at this time, discussing some concepts and terminology. This term being forms. What are forms? Within QuickBooks has some specialized terminology that means different things, both in terms of separation from accounting terms, the language of accounting, and in terms of just everyday language. So in other words, we could have some terms that will be in accounting that we may not use all the time in everyday language. We could have some terms in QuickBooks that may even differ from what might be used in normal accounting times kind of terms. Forms is going to be something that will be used within QuickBooks, and it's going to be the driving kind of factors. Anything that we enter data into, QuickBooks sees as the form. So the form is going to be the data input that we will enter the data input. That data input is what's going to be used in order to drive the financial statements and the creation of the financial statements as well as other reports. We won't go through the tracking of each form because we saw those when we went through them by vendor and customer and employee section. Just be aware that all these items that we are entering data into, whether it be a bill, whether it be a create an invoice, or create a sales receipts, these are types of forms. These are areas that have been preset up by the system so that somebody that is just entering data can enter the data as easily as possible, and then QuickBooks can use those forms in order to generate reports. So our goal with these forms is a couple things. We want to make the data input as easy as possible, both to input and for us to track. In order to do that, in order to set up these forms, we have to know a little bit on the setup side. So the real difficult thing with QuickBooks is really going to be how do we set up the data input so that the creation of this form is as easy as possible. And then in terms of interpreting the data, how do we know what QuickBooks is actually doing? How can we read the financial statements? And how can we know if there's a problem? And if there is a problem, where do we go in terms of how that problem is being constructed? So what we just want to understand at this point is that the data input here is going to be input into forms. When we think of data input in terms of normal, just financial accounting, we usually think of data as financial transactions recorded in terms of an accounting equation and or in terms of debits and credits. We still have debits and credits in the accounting equation that is supporting QuickBooks, but it's kind of hidden behind forms. And the reason it is, it could make things more complex in some ways because we can't really see the transparency here. I can't see exactly what the debit, if I click on an invoice, for example, this is a form. If I go back to an invoice, I can't really see what the debit and credit is here, as I could if I just wrote down the debit and credit. But the form is going to help us, for people that don't know debits and credits, to just enter the data as easily as possible. We can separate duties and have people that are entering invoices just enter the invoices. That's all they really need to do. That's all they really need to know in order to enter the invoice. So that's going to be one of the points of it. And we're going to think about then every type of transaction we have in terms of forms. So for example, if we go to our normal financial statements, we're going to close that out. We're going to go to the reports. We're going to go to company and financial, and we'll go down to the balance sheet. Balance sheet standard, and I'm going to change the date range up top, customize reports, and we'll go to the date range of 01/01/19, January 1st, 2019, and 12/31/19, December 31st, 2019, and OK. So if we go to the creation of the financial statements, say the checking account, which is going to have the most kind of diversity in the types of forms, if we double click on it, then the forms are what's going to be driving the type over here. So we don't see just the debits and credits here, we see these forms. Anytime we enter something, it will be a form. So this was created by a deposit. If we double click on it, this is a deposit form that drove this transaction. There is a debit and credit in a transaction in accordance with the accounting equation, in accordance with debits and credits related to it, but we're trying to run the whole thing just with forms. So if there's any default form, in other words, that QuickBooks can create, it will create a form for the transaction. So we'll close this back out. And so that's a deposit. Here's a check. A check is a form. So the check is going to look like this. This is a form where data has been input into the system. QuickBooks is always going to use this form whenever the check is made. And this form means, of course, the checking account is going down and some other account is being affected. If we close that, then we're going to say that some other forms, here's a check, but it's a bill payment form. So it was a bill payment is the data input screen that we have. This is a form, it's a check, but it's a paycheck. So the actual data screen is going to be the paycheck. So these items, this is a bill payment form, liability check form. These are all different data input screens that are going to drive the same transaction, but QuickBooks will have these forms. So if you think about how QuickBooks is made, then the forms are what are going to drive the transaction. QuickBooks will default every time we enter a transaction to first being a form. So all the backup and supporting documentation will be in the format of a form. And then if there is no form to support it, QuickBooks will then make a journal entry with it. So if we see this type column here, we're always going to have some type of form unless it's a transaction that doesn't have a related form, in which case it'll have a journal entry. We'll have to use a journal entry, and that'll be the form that will be used within the system. It'll be a journal. And if we'll close this back out, I'm going to go to the accounts receivable to see that. If we scroll back down in the account, we'll see these journal entries. That's the default. If it can't find anything else, it'll have a journal entry. If we go back to the home page, you might say, well, when would it not have something else? Notice that these are all the normal transactions that happen. So anything that happens in a day-to-day process, if it's something that happens all the time, we enter bills all the time, we buy inventory all the time, we pay bills all the time, we invoice people all the time, we have customer receipts all the time, employees is very standard. If it's a very standard transaction, QuickBooks will have a standard form for it, and we'll try to customize that process as easily as possible so that we can train anybody to simply fill out the form and not really have to know how the form was constructed or what the form is doing in terms of creating the financial statements. If, however, we're talking about something that's more unusual, like an owner putting money into the company, that doesn't happen all the time, or we purchase equipment, a large piece of equipment for debt, we finance the equipment, or we take out a loan, then that doesn't happen all the time. Then QuickBooks isn't going to have a transaction possibly that will just drive that transaction. It might be, so a transaction that's not as common, a day-to-day transaction, is going to be a transaction that may not have a form to it, and therefore we'll have to use a journal entry. So just be aware that any of these types of things are going to be the forms, and you want to see them both ways. You want to see them in creating the form. How does that affect the financial statement? And then you want to go to the financial statements and take a look at the forms that have been used in order to create them. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info.